Hey everybody, welcome back to UFD Tech. It's time for another experimental video, but instead of mixing old hardware with new hardware like we've done in the past couple of videos, we're going to take new hardware and mix it with new hardware. 8700K GT 1030. It's not exactly new, it's a couple years old at this point, but it's the newest we have. However, the experiment we have today is the computer equivalent of skipping leg day. We're gonna be using the GT 1030 as our primary game graphics card, and we're gonna be supplementing it with a GTX 1080 Ti as a PhysX card. We're gonna be doing that in the games that support PhysX, primarily like Batman Arkham Knight and Fallout 4 and a few others. And we're gonna see just how much can this thing be accelerated by the 1080 Ti taking over the physics side of things. So with that being said, let's just start building the PC and then get to benchmarking. Okay, the system is set up. We have the 1030 right here in the system with the 1080 Ti acting as the physics card. One of the things that we had to figure out with our testing was the fact that having the 1080 Ti present in the system automatically boosted the performance. It was dedicated to physics no matter what we did. So the only way to test the stock performance of the 1030 was to remove it out of the system completely. We only ended up testing 4 games for all of this because there just aren't that many physics games. Like if we take a look at list that's on Wikipedia, which I'm sure is not completely the entire list, but we see that the last one released that had physics support was in August 30th of 2017. So we're nearly a year from the last release with the physics, and then the last big game that I remember is basically Fallout 4, which came out in 2016, and then prior to that was Arkham Knight in 2015. It's just not something that's practically used a whole lot. Project Cars has it, but Project Cars 2 doesn't appear to have it, but Project Cars only had its CPU, not GPU dedicated physics. So I guess one of the things that we were really trying to figure out with this experiment, if we could call it give it any sort of meaning besides hey, this is just a fun, kooky little thing. The question I guess we sought to answer was how much physics processing is necessary when those particle effects and everything that is dedicated to the physics processor, how much does that take up of a GPU's horsepower, which we can kind of figure out by putting in the worst case scenario of the 1030 with a 1080 Ti doing all of the heavy lifting after that. So we actually did several different scenarios, which you're gonna see on the screen. We did a mixture of both 720p and 1080p, as well as low and high settings in the 4 different games that we tested in order to kind of figure out where does the biggest impact to performance come in. Okay, so let's start with the worst game of all time, Batman Arkham Knight, which was a horrible release on launch. If we take a look at the GT 1030 at high settings, 720p, it got 15 frames per second. High at 1080p, it got 9 frames per second. These are averages. Low 720p, it got 62 frames, and then low 1080p, it got 35 frames per second. So that's the 1030 stock by itself. As you can see, at the high settings, which is probably where all of the physics dedicated stuff comes in, it got absolutely slaughtered. Even 720p was basically unplayable, with 1% lows being 5 frames per second. Then if we take a look, okay, we added the 1080 Ti physics card and tested it on the exact same settings. At 720p high, we go from 15 frames to 38, 153% increase in the 1030's performance. Then if we go from high 1080p, we go from 9 frames per second to 23. Again, 150% increase in performance. Then at low settings in Batman, we actually see that there's hardly any physics processing going on, with going from 62 frames per second at 720p to 65 with the physics card, and then at 1080p we go from 35 frames per second to 36, gains of around 4 and 2% respectively, and even then it's kind of that could be margin of error, not really a big deal. So Batman on high has a lot of physics processing that could actually be offloaded to a different card completely, which if you do have a spare card and this is the game that you want to play from 3 years ago, why not go ahead and do it? Maybe not a 1080 Ti, but a 750 Ti with your 1060 1080p might be worth it. Let's go ahead and take a look at Borderlands 2, which is the next game that we tested. So high 720p, 63 frames per second, high 1080p, 40 frames per second, low 720p, 184, low 1080p, 96. Then as soon as we added the 1080 Ti physics card at high settings, 720p, we saw an increase of 23.81%. And then at high 1080p, we saw an increase of 12%. But then this is where like variability in the testing really came in. At both low settings of 720p and 1080p, we actually lost frames per second of a 2% and a 1% loss, which is just because the benchmark wasn't entirely reproducible. There's no stock benchmark. We actually ran through it and different particle effects going off at different times. So basically they're exactly the same for whatever intents and purposes. No difference between having a physics card at low settings and high settings. Then for Fallout 4, high settings, 720p and 1080p, we got 58 and 34 frames per second. And then low settings, 720p, we got 58 and 58. And that's because Fallout 4 has a frame rate cap built into the game. And if you increase the frame rate cap, it actually runs the game faster. So you can't like get beyond that. It doesn't really work. If we look at the high 720p, low 720p, and low 1080p, those are going to remain the same basically no matter what. Between 57 and 60 FPS completely throughout the board, there's no FPS increase there because there can't be. But if we look at high 1080p, we go from 34 frames per second to a whopping 38, an increase of 11%. But then we also look at the 1% and 0.1% lows. Those are definitely higher, so it actually helped somewhat. Then for the last game we tested, Metro Last Light, high settings, 720p, 1080p, we have frame rates of 32 frames and 18 frames. Then at low settings for 720p, we get 109 FPS, and a low 1080p, we get 58 FPS. But then taking a look, once we had the physics card, the only setting that saw any improvement was high 720p. High 1080p didn't make a difference. It looks like the GPU is just bottlenecking everything, including the physics enableizations. So the 720p high, we go from 32 to 36, which is a 12% gain. Everything else is basically the same or slightly higher, nearly no difference whatsoever. Then we just for kicks and giggles to look at how bad the 1030 is, we decided to test the 1080 Ti with the 1030 as its physics card at 4K to see what kind of frame rate we get. For Batman, we saw a 65 FPS average, which we only saw at low settings 720p with the 1030 and the physics card. Then for Borderlands, we got 115 frames per second, which again beats basically everything that we did with the 1030. Fallout 4, 60 frames per second, again because there's a cap. And then Metro, this one actually really hurt the 1080 Ti. We got 32 frames per second, which is the same as the high 720p setting that we got with the GT 1030 and the 1080 Ti physics card. So all of this is basically to say none of this is worth it. This makes absolutely no sense. And their only game where we saw any sort of marginal improvement or any sort of noticeable improvement was Batman Arkham Knight. Everything else was kind of like, it's not really worth having a physics card whatsoever. Like basically, like there's small improvements, but even going from the worst graphics card we could get to the best graphics card we can get as a physics card, it just doesn't make any sense, and we can kind of see why physics games just don't really exist anymore. It's not worth it. Like, to code all that to be processed on a separate physics engine just doesn't yield the results that people want it to. It's like, this is worse than SLI. Like, if we got two 1030s and we use explicit multi-adapter, we should probably be able to get more of a performance gain than we did with adding a 1080 Ti physics card. And I mean, that's basically the conclusion. Physics cards are no longer worth it. You probably shouldn't use it, like, unless Batman Arkham Knight, which was the worst game ever launched, Warner Brothers should feel ashamed of themselves. Unless that's your jam that you're playing all the time, it's not gonna work. Before we close out this video, I just wanted to inform you guys that it was brought to you by Wootware. They help sponsor all of the parts that we use to make this horrific Frankenstein experiment happen. So if you're in South Africa, you're looking for a place to actually purchase your next computer, your next rig upgrade, anything that you might be looking for. If you want to do something as insane as a 1030 with the 1080 Ti physics card, they'll likely sell it to you, but they'll also tell you you're insane at the same time. But check out Wootware for their fantastic prices, their amazing selection, and their tremendous customer service. They are just top level when it comes to making sure that you get everything you need. So if you're in South Africa looking to boot up your PC, check out wootware.co.za to boot up your life. Like, that's what we do. Check the link in the video description to learn more. Go to them, buy stuff, do it, because they sponsor us. that's where I'm gonna wrap up this video. Do you have any other kooky experiments you kind of want us to try? Any weird system configurations that you've always wondered about and you think that could make a cool video? Let us know down in the comments. We're keen to try out this reckless type of content engagement. Let me know what you thought of this video by smashing the like button. Please get subscribed to stay up to date on all of our tech related content. I'm Brett with the UFD Tech channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.